My son grabbed my neck and called me worthless. A week later, he was on his knees at the courthouse. I didn't even look at him once. I leaned back in my creaking porch chair, the late Utah sun slicing through the pines, and let the words hang in the air. Quiet settled over me, heavier than anger. I knew then that patience, not fury, would chart the path ahead. Before I tell you how it all turned around, hit subscribe and let me know which state you're listening from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning started like any other in the little mountain town of Haversfield, Utah. Pine needles rustled under the breeze, the smell of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. I had just poured a cup of coffee, the warmth seeping into my hands when I heard the garage door creak. My son, Tom, was there before breakfast, face tight, eyes restless, as though the mountain air itself had sharpened his temper. We had a long history of quiet tension, the kind that builds over decades. Tom had always felt I favored his younger sister, Emma, a perception I never encouraged yet never quite corrected. It festered like the cracks in the old cedar siding of my porch. I knew he nursed resentment for years, thinking every opportunity I gave him, every loan, every chance to attend college, had been done to keep him indebted, controlled, or less capable. The truth was, I had trusted him, given him the farm, the savings, the house, believing he would take them forward responsibly, but he had long interpreted my trust as weakness. "Dad," he said, voice low but hard, "you've spent your life telling me I'm not enough, making me second in everything. You're just holding out on me, keeping everything for Emma. You're worthless to me, and maybe even to yourself." I froze for a second, the mug halfway to my lips, the steam curling lazily into the pine-scented air. His hand shot forward, grabbing my neck, fingers tight, as if to punctuate his accusation. My body tensed, a reflex, but my mind remained unnervingly calm. He wanted an argument, a fight, a scene. He wanted me to erupt, to cry, to show weakness. I remembered the nights I had spent awake, signing tuition checks for him, patching roofs, helping him start that failing construction business. I remembered the car rides, talking softly about responsibility, sacrifice, and pride, while he rolled his eyes, impatient, convinced I didn't understand him. I had thought those years would build loyalty. Instead, they had built entitlement. I took a measured breath. Let the cold wind wash over me. Let him feel the weight of his own fury without my reaction. "Tom," I said quietly, voice low, steady, "I did everything I could to help you be more than you think you are. If that's worthless to you, then it's your burden, not mine." His grip faltered, confusion flickering across his face. The anger had been his shield. Now it felt like a veil thinning. I stepped back slowly, letting him release me. The silence that followed was thick, punctuated only by the faint hum of the coffee machine and a crow's caw from the pines. I turned to the kitchen table where papers and documents lay, the farm deed, savings account statements, insurance policies. For a moment, I wondered if he would even notice, if he had ever truly understood. I packed a small duffel with essentials, clothes, my old ledger, a few cherished photographs. The tactile act of packing became a ritual of reclaiming myself, of quietly refusing to be a victim in my own house. As I walked to my truck, the frost on the windshield glinted in the morning sun. The engine rumbled awake, and I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel with deliberate calm. I didn't glance at Tom. He stayed on the porch, fists clenched, eyes narrowing like storm clouds over the peaks. His betrayal stung, yes, but it was no longer a shock. I had seen the signs, his bitterness, his covert manipulations of my accounts, his whispered complaints to neighbors, all pointing to this inevitable moment. The road stretched ahead, winding through the pines, each turn reminding me of years spent teaching patience, resilience, and endurance. I let the engines hum steady me, the mountains flanking me like silent witnesses. Tom had acted out of greed, jealousy, and a misreading of my intentions. He wanted control over my legacy, over the farm, over the money I had saved for decades. More than that, he wanted to humiliate me, to prove that his anger could overpower my dignity, but I wasn't giving him that satisfaction. Not today. Not ever. That decision, calm and deliberate, was a weight I carried with certainty as I drove away from the house I had built, both literally and figuratively, for the family I had loved. The sun rose higher, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. Behind me, the house stood quiet, Tom's silhouette still on the porch. Ahead, the road promised solitude, planning, and the first real steps toward justice, not through confrontation, but through measured action. They thought I was gone for good. They had no idea what was coming. As I drove past the bank, the numbers came back before the pain did. Tuition payments for Tom and Emma, hundreds of dollars a month for decades. Repairs on the farmhouse after winter snows, boards, shingles, tools. The loan I had co-signed to help him start that construction business, the one that went under after 2 years. Every penny, every hour, every compromise, all quietly counted in my mind. I remembered evenings by the fire, handing him envelopes of cash, talking softly about responsibility, about learning from mistakes. He had nodded, eyes bright with promise. Yet somewhere along the way, that trust had twisted into entitlement. I had built, maintained, and nurtured. I had given him leverage, opportunity, a chance to rise. And in return, I had received this. That's what fathers do, I reminded myself. You give, you teach, you step back, even when it hurts. You don't demand gratitude. You don't plead for respect. You prepare them to be better than you, or at least you hope they will be. The memory of his hands on my neck made me shiver despite the warmth of the truck's heater. I thought about all those nights staying up late, filling out insurance forms, managing taxes, ensuring the farm could survive another season. Back then, I thought I was protecting them, giving them a future. Turns out, I was erasing my own peace in the process. I reached for the old ledger in the passenger seat. The inked numbers seemed to whisper back. Every dollar given, every sacrifice made, had been noted. Not by him, but by life itself. A quiet awakening settled over me. Clarity edged with grief. I didn't know then that every dollar I gave would buy me silence later. The mountains loomed ahead, steadfast and indifferent, as though urging me forward. What came next would rewrite everything I believed about family. I didn't book a motel. There was one person in Haversfield I trusted enough to knock on his door without explanation. Old Ben Harper, who'd taught me how to mend a fence and how to gut trout without fuss. Ben's place sat 2 ridges over from mine, a weathered clapboard house with a porch swing that squeaked in the evenings and a woodpile so neatly stacked it could have been measured with a ruler. When I pulled into his gravel drive, he was on the porch shelling peas, the neighborly way of a man who kept his hands busy so his mind could stay clear. He didn't ask many questions. He offered me a cup of coffee, the kind that tasted of bitterness and sturdiness, handed me a wool blanket, and showed me the guest room with sheets still smelling faintly of lavender. It felt less like charity and more like the practical kindness of people who'd seen one another through bad winters. I sat, my duffel on the chair, and unfolded the old ledger, laying it next to my watch, a pen ready like a compass. Ben and I kept to our routines. Mornings were for breakfast at the diner, eggs over easy, black coffee, and the same 2 men at the counter exchanging weather and politics like a ritual. Afternoons I spent at Ben's kitchen table, where the light from the west window slanted across the paper and made everything look more honest. I made lists, accounts to call, documents to find, names to jot down. I phoned the bank with a calm voice and noted times and extensions. Each call was a small, deliberate reclaiming. At night, I walked the lane behind Ben's house. The pines were tall and regular, the kind of trees that reminded you life outlasted most tempers. I practiced keeping my face neutral. I practiced saying facts, not feelings, aloud. Account number, date, amount, I would murmur, like a litany. The ledger filled in with neat, stubborn lines. There was a certain satisfaction in the order of it. Columns aligned, sums verified, signatures circled. Planning became a kind of prayer. Ben listened when I told him what had happened, nodding once in that plain way of his. He told me about a cousin who'd been burned by trust and learned to keep things in writing. "You do it clean," he said. "You do it by the book. Let the paper talk for you." His words were simple, but they settled in me like gravel under a wheel, steadying the course. Before bed, I tucked the photographs into a folder and slid the farm deed into an envelope, labeled and dated. I left a small note on the kitchen table, for Ben. Nothing dramatic, just a thank you and the promise I'd return the favor. Outside, a truck idled somewhere down the road for a few minutes and then moved off. I couldn't tell if it was coincidence or the faint stirrings of trouble, but I wrote down the time just the same. The next morning, I started with the bank. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and stale coffee. I approached the teller, calm and precise, giving my name, account numbers, and the facts. Everything clean, verifiable, undeniable. "I'd like to confirm all activity on these accounts," I said, voice steady. No emotion, just procedure. The clerk blinked a few times, then nodded, tapping keys. I noted times and confirmation numbers in my ledger, each entry a small reclaiming of control. Next came the insurance company. Policies had lapsed, claims misfiled, payments redirected without my knowledge. I called each agent in turn, asked for records, confirmed beneficiaries, and corrected discrepancies. Each correction was deliberate enough to leave no doubt. One agent hesitated, a flicker of recognition passing her eyes, and I made a note of it. Someone else must have tried to touch this before. By mid-afternoon, I was at the county office reviewing property records. I requested copies of deeds, easements, and any filings that bore my name. The clerk behind the counter gave me a long look, but complied without fuss. Step by step, document by document, I reclaimed every thread of what I had built, not with anger, but with order. Between calls and filings, I returned to Ben's kitchen table. Coffee cooling in the mug, sunlight cutting across the ledger. Each signature, each verified line, was a quiet protest against betrayal. The act itself felt more satisfying than any argument or confrontation could have. My hands moved deliberately, my mind focused. Every correction, every call, every note in my ledger was a brick laid in the foundation of my peace. By evening, I stepped onto Ben's porch, the sky bleeding pink and orange behind the ridges. I breathed in the pine-scented air, realizing for the first time that reclaiming control wasn't about punishing Tom. It was about protecting myself, my legacy, and the truth. I watched the light shift, knowing the next moves would be critical, but feeling a measure of calm I hadn't felt in weeks. Step by step, account by account, record by record, I was reclaiming everything that had been taken, not through anger, but through precision. And as the mountains darkened behind me, I understood something profound. Justice, when approached with clarity and patience, carries a weight no rage can match. The evening settled over Ben's porch like a soft blanket. The coffee cup I'd left cooling on the table was long empty, the ink on my ledger dry and deliberate. The accounts were corrected, the deeds confirmed, the insurance policies clarified. Step by step, I'd put everything back in order. Now, all that remained was quiet. I leaned back in the wooden chair, listening to the wind through the pines. Somewhere down the lane, A dog barked. The air smelled faintly of smoke and late summer earth. I felt the emptiness that follows action. Not sorrow exactly, but a hollow calm, the stillness that comes before a storm. Tom had no idea how methodical I had been. He thought he could unsettle me, bend me with anger or shame. But for the first time in years, I felt untouchable, anchored by my own preparation. I watched an elderly couple across the road tending their garden, moving in quiet harmony, laughing softly at some shared memory. I envied their peace for a moment, then realized I had built my own version. A different sort of order, not of soil and sun, but of truth, law, and principle. Yet beneath the calm, a small knot of anticipation stirred. I sensed that repercussions were coming. Actions rarely remain unseen, and even the most meticulous efforts draw attention. Somewhere, Tom's anger was already stirring, poised for the next move. I took a deep breath, writing the time in the ledger. The mountains behind Ben's house were dark silhouettes now, but they felt steady, patient. I allowed myself one last moment of stillness, knowing tomorrow would demand all the careful planning I had laid down, before silence became the only language left between me and what used to be called home. By the third morning at Ben's, the Yalquist wind had shifted, carrying the dry scent of pine needles and dust from the ridges above Haversfield. I had reviewed the ledger one last time, each entry clean, each account verified, calls made, paperwork filed, the house, my name, the farm, all secured. And yet, despite the meticulous work, I knew one thing. Preparation would meet its test. Today. The knock came mid-morning, sharp, deliberate. Tom's voice followed almost immediately. "Dad, we need to talk." I opened the door slowly. He was taller than I remembered, broad shoulders, but his eyes betrayed hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty I hadn't seen in decades. Behind him stood his wife, arms folded, an expression of quiet judgment. Or maybe disbelief. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. The living room smelled faintly of Ben's wood polish and last night's stew. I gestured toward the chairs by the window. Sunlight streamed across the floorboards, illuminating dust motes that swirled lazily in the air. He hesitated, then sat, hands gripping his knees. His wife remained standing, eyes sharp. Tom started with anger, voice tight. "You shouldn't have left. You can't just walk out, Dad. You think you can take everything and leave me nothing?" I didn't flinch. I spoke quietly, with a clarity that cut deeper than yelling ever could. I didn't take anything. I secured what was already mine. You only perceive loss because you misread generosity as weakness. He looked away, the anger giving way to confusion. I continued, slowly, deliberately, pointing out the facts I had quietly prepared. The accounts you accessed were corrected. The farm deed is secured. The insurance policies have the proper beneficiaries. You wanted leverage. I provided clarity. A pause. Silence thickened the room. The only sound was the faint creak of the window frame, the distant hum of a truck on the ridge road. He swallowed, lips dry. Then came the words that would mark the turning point. I didn't know it was like this." "You should have," I said, tone unwavering. "Every warning, every conversation, every chance I gave you to handle responsibility. You ignored or twisted it. I gave you opportunity. You made it a weapon." He leaned forward, finally, face pale, voice breaking. I thought you didn't trust me. That you were keeping it all from me because you didn't care about me, that I wasn't. Enough!" I looked at him carefully. Years of resentment, pent-up frustration, and misinterpretation rolled off him in waves. But I didn't argue. I didn't justify. I didn't plead. Instead, I allowed him to feel the weight of his choices. I let the quiet, the facts, the calm authority in the room speak for themselves. You've had every chance to be honest, Tom, I said. The path back is simple. You acknowledge the truth, take responsibility, and move forward. Anything else is merely chaos masquerading as defiance. He shook his head slowly. And the farm? The accounts? Everything gone? I didn't take anything. I merely ensured that the truth is intact. You can't claim what isn't yours. That's how this works, I replied, calm but precise. I can and I did. That is the boundary. His wife shifted, voice low, cautious. Maybe. Maybe we overstepped. Maybe we were wrong. I let them speak, the words tumbling over each other, raw and unfiltered. I sat quietly, absorbing it all. Years of planning, preparation, and silent observation had led to this moment. No anger, no retaliation, just truth, documented and undeniable. I paused, looking out the window at the mountains, the distant pine ridges steady as ever, then back to Tom. I loved you always. But love is measured in responsibility, not entitlement. You've mistaken control for courage, recognition for respect. Now you know the difference. He slumped in the chair, exhaustion replacing defiance. I saw the old boy I had once held on my knee, teaching him to tie knots and mend fences. But that boy had grown into a man shaped by impatience and misjudgment. I felt a pang of sadness, but not regret. I had done everything I could to guide him. What came after was his choice. Finally, he spoke, voice small. I understand. I'll fix it. I'll make it right. You can start by being honest, I said. Publicly, privately, it doesn't matter. Truth is the only redemption you have now. He nodded, and then slowly he rose, moving toward the door. I didn't move. I didn't call after him. The decision, the recognition, the burden of consequence, all of it rested on him now. He stepped outside, and I heard the truck door shut. Quiet settled again. I returned to the ledger, making a note of the time. The act of confrontation, measured and restrained, had shifted the balance. I didn't need to shout or argue. Justice had arrived quietly, precisely, with no theatrics. Outside, the wind stirred the pine needles. Sunlight slanted through the branches, dust motes dancing in its path. I leaned back in the chair, sipping my coffee. It tasted of warmth and calm. The confrontation was over, not with victory or humiliation, but with clarity and dignity. I picked up my keys, thinking maybe breakfast at the diner would help clear my head. After all, every new chapter deserves a quiet beginning. The morning after the confrontation, I took my coffee to the porch, watching the low mist curl along the ridges behind Ben's house. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. For the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe slowly, thinking not of anger but of the next steps. The confrontation had cleared the emotional haze, but I sensed something deeper, something I hadn't anticipated. I walked the lane toward the diner, the gravel crunching underfoot. The town seemed quiet, almost watchful, as if Haversfield itself was holding its breath. Inside, the usual early crowd murmured over coffee and toast. I nodded at a few familiar faces. Their eyes flicked with understanding. When I ordered, I did so mechanically, letting the steam of the coffee cup ground me. Then came the call that would shift everything. Margaret, the bank manager I had spoken with a week ago, was on the line. Her voice was low, cautious. Sir, I need to mention something. A few accounts were accessed after your requests. There are discrepancies. Forged signatures, transactions that shouldn't have happened. It looks like someone close to you may have had outside help. I paused, letting her words sink. Outside, a truck rumbled down the lane, fading in the distance. Discrepancies, forged signatures, outside help. Do you have details? I asked, calm, noting every word in the ledger I carried with me. Yes. It seems the insurance claims were altered and one of the construction loans, the one in your son's name, was manipulated. There's a paper trail, but it's messy. You might want to see this in person. I thanked her and hung up, sipping the coffee. The warmth did little to stop the cold clarity settling in my chest. It wasn't just entitlement or frustration driving Tom. This was exploitation. Years of giving, of trust, had been twisted into financial manipulation. By midday, I was at the bank, reviewing statements and filings. Margaret and her assistant pulled folders and ledgers, highlighting transactions. That didn't match. I traced signatures with my finger, noting every irregularity. Each forged entry, each redirected payment, told a story. A story of someone who had treated my life's work like a ledger to be bent for personal gain. I left the bank and walked slowly down Main Street. Sunlight reflected off windows, bouncing, in patterns that reminded me of the ledger's neat columns. My mind worked like a metronome, deliberate, precise. Calls to the insurance companies followed, confirming claims. The construction loan documents were retrieved, every page scanned, cross-checked, and logged. By mid-afternoon, I visited the county office to check the property records once again. There, tucked among filings and official stamps, I discovered that a signature had been forged on a recent easement attempt. Someone had tried to lay claim, manipulate boundaries, and redirect benefits. I wrote it all down in the ledger, careful to record time, place, and witness. A small flicker of anger rose, but I controlled it. I didn't need emotion. I had facts. The ledger was full now, each entry a weapon of proof. Step by step, the narrative was shifting from personal betrayal to moral reckoning. Tom had tried to use every tool available to manipulate what wasn't his, and now every irregularity was documented, undeniable. I returned to Ben's house as dusk approached. The pine-scented wind had shifted again, carrying a hint of smoke from a neighbor's chimney. I placed the documents neatly on the kitchen table, reviewing each one. There was no need to rush. The facts would speak louder than any argument, louder than any plea. Tomorrow, I would walk into the authorities' office with evidence, not emotion. As I poured another cup of coffee, I noticed the ledger's spine had begun to crack slightly from constant use. Each bend, each annotation, each line of careful observation had created a record of truth. This wasn't about revenge in the dramatic sense. It was about reclaiming integrity, about ensuring that betrayal couldn't hide behind the shadows of assumed trust. Outside, the sky shifted from orange to deep purple. The mountains stood steady, indifferent to human folly. I felt a calm resolve settle over me. Tom had underestimated the patience, precision, and quiet determination of someone who had nothing left to lose except dignity. I let myself sit in, the stillness, knowing the ledger held the weight of truth. From that moment, it wasn't family anymore. It was a case file. The next morning, I returned to Ben's house with a quiet sense of purpose. The ledger lay open on the kitchen table, every irregularity, every forged signature, every altered account meticulously recorded. It was heavy with truth. I took a sip of coffee and considered my next steps. No emotion, no dramatics, just methodical action. Step 1. Filing reports. I started at the local police station, presenting the documentation in neat stacks. Each folder was labeled with dates, times, and witness information. The officer, a young man with a clean-shaven face and careful eyes, glanced at the first folder and paused. "Sir, this is thorough. I'd like this to be formally logged," I said. "I'm not asking for opinions, only that the facts be recorded. Each entry here has supporting evidence." I watched him nod as he made copies, stapled exhibits, and typed notes into the system. I noted each action in my ledger. Step by step, the truth was becoming official. Next came the county office for property records. I presented the forged easement attempt along with supporting documentation. The clerk reviewed signatures, cross-checked previous filings, and confirmed the forgery. "This will prevent any claim from being recognized," she said. I made a note in the ledger, feeling satisfaction in the precision of procedure rather than the thrill of victory. Banking institutions followed. I contacted every bank and credit union involved, presenting verified statements and official letters. "Please freeze these accounts," I instructed calmly, "and flag any attempts at unauthorized withdrawal." Each clerk complied without question. One bank manager hesitated, recalling Margaret's earlier caution, and I noted it. Another link in the chain, another indication of just how far this manipulation had reached. By late afternoon, I visited the insurance companies. Policies that had been misfiled or redirected were corrected. Beneficiaries were verified. Claims were voided and reissued with proper documentation. Every conversation was conducted in professional tone, polite, precise, and unyielding. I left no room for dispute. Returning to Ben's house, I reviewed everything again. Ledger entries stacked, folders labeled, copies made, each page reinforced. The truth. Tom had manipulated, forged, and misused trust and generosity. Yet the ledger was more than evidence. It was a shield, protecting my legacy, my name, and the life I had built. That evening, I walked the ridge behind Ben's house. The wind was cool, carrying the pine and smoke from distant chimneys. I thought about how long it had taken to reach this point. Decades of work, years of patience, moments of quiet observation. The confrontation had been only the beginning. The legal and procedural work was the real reclamation. Back inside, I made calls to a few community members I trusted. Neighbors, the pastor, the librarian. I didn't ask for intervention, only documentation. "If anyone asks about the recent account issues or property filings," I told them, "tell the truth. Facts, nothing else." Their affirmations, simple and quiet, reinforced the moral fabric I was weaving. Truth, once documented, carries weight in a way rumor cannot. I spent the night at Ben's, reviewing every phone call, every bank response, every record. By the time I finally sat back, exhausted, the house felt calm, almost sacred. In towns like Haversfield, truth travels faster than rumor, and it doesn't stop. Every neighbor, every clerk, every observer now had access to the facts. The narrative was no longer mine to defend emotionally. It was factual, unassailable, and irreversible. The next morning, I returned to the police station to verify that all reports had been filed, copies attached, and follow-up procedures initiated. Detective Larson, a methodical man in his 50s, confirmed each piece of evidence. "You've built a very complete picture here," he said. "No one could dispute these documents. The law will follow exactly as it should." I nodded, recording the confirmation time in the ledger. Then came the final step, letting the truth circulate naturally through the community. I made no announcements, posted no warnings, but townspeople, those who had witnessed the subtle manipulations or overheard conversations, began to see patterns, quiet inquiries, whispered confirmations, and sympathetic glances gradually formed a social echo that reinforced the legal truth. The moment the facts aligned with perception, no argument could overwrite them. By evening, I sat on Ben's porch, watching the sun dip behind the pine-lined ridges. The ledger lay open, every page accounted for. Accounts reclaimed, property secured, insurance corrected, community awareness subtly aligned. My name was no longer tied to confusion, manipulation, or false narratives. The groundwork for the next moves was complete. The confrontation had happened, the deeper betrayal was revealed, and now The formal procedural reclamation was in place. Everything from here on would be handled by paper, not pain. Step by step, document by document, phone call by phone call, the narrative had been reclaimed, verified, and set in motion. I didn't need anger. I didn't need theatrics. Law, order, and methodical precision had done what fury never could. And as the stars began to appear over the ridges, I realized something profound. When truth is documented, shared, and verified, it carries a weight that no resentment can shake. Tom could scream, lie, or manipulate all he wanted. The ledger, the filings, the evidence, and the community awareness formed a lattice of inevitability. I closed the ledger carefully, marking the time and date of the final verification. Tomorrow, the consequences would become undeniable. The calm, lawful, methodical truth would intersect with human error, pride, and misjudgment. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to sip the last of the coffee, feeling a measured satisfaction, not triumph. Haversfield would see the facts, and the weight of deception would finally meet the weight of justice. The night settled over the ridges quietly, as if nature itself acknowledged that a reckoning, precise and unavoidable, was underway. The morning was quiet, the frost still clinging to the edges of the old maple leaves outside Ben's house. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the cold settle and clear the mind. After yesterday's filings and verifications, the procedural groundwork was in place. The ledger was full, evidence stacked and organized, and the community's awareness of the truth had begun to ripple subtly. I ventured into town mid-morning, walking past the familiar hardware store where the bell above the door jingled with every customer. Faces I had known for years acknowledged me with small nods or brief words of encouragement. The truth, documented and quietly disseminated, had begun to align social perception with legal fact. People didn't need me to explain anything. The ledger, the filings, and the evidence spoke louder than any argument. At the diner, the usual crowd was gathered. Breakfast plates in front of them, mugs steaming with black coffee. I slid into a booth, nodding at the counter, and overheard fragments of conversation. One man mentioned the unusual activity with the bank, another the corrective, filings at the county office. No names were spoken, just facts aligning in whispers. Moral clarity had a way of traveling quietly, like smoke on a cold morning. But then came the first sign that Tom hadn't yet accepted the inevitability of consequence. A neighbor dropped a subtle warning while I filled my cup from the coffee. Pot. "He's been talking," she murmured, "claiming you've overstepped, saying things you didn't do." I set the cup down with deliberate calm. The ledger sat beside me, a tactile reminder that every word he might say could be measured against documented truth. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply noted it. Facts, not fury, were my allies now. Later that afternoon, a call came from Detective Larson. "Sir, there's been a complaint filed against you," he said, voice even. "Allegations of harassment." "Harassment?" I repeated, sipping the coffee as if the words themselves had little weight. Apparently he's trying to create a counter-narrative, using claims of intimidation to muddy the water. I smiled faintly, a slow, calm smile. "I'll send you my documentation, time-stamped and verified." By evening, I returned to Ben's house, laying out every call record, bank correspondence, and county filing in neat stacks. The documentation would counter every fabricated allegation. I noted each sequence in the ledger, recording times, dates, and witnesses. The counterattack was already underway, but I would meet it with calm precision, not anger. Then came the late-night call. The emotional ambush I had anticipated but could not fully predict. The phone vibrated sharply on the counter, a small, insistent pulse in the darkness. I picked it up. "Dad, it's me." Tom's voice trembled, rehearsed, the kind of sincerity practiced in mirrors. I didn't mean... I'm sick. I need you to understand. Please, I can't do this without you. I held the phone lightly, not rising from the chair. His words were designed to flicker empathy, to destabilize control. I let a pause stretch long enough to remind both of us who was holding the ground. I hear you, I said slowly, neutral, measured. Everything you've done is documented. There was a catch in his voice, a brief stammer that betrayed his awareness. But I just want you to forgive me. Everything can be like before. Nothing can be like before, I said calmly. Not until every action matches every word. Not until facts align with truth. I wrote the time and content of the call in the ledger. It was more than documentation. It was a mirror reflecting his own manipulation back at him. Over the next few days, Tom's attempts escalated. Emails, letters, small visits at the edge of the property, each one recorded with the same methodical precision. Every attempted emotional provocation was catalogued, timestamps, descriptions, reactions noted in the ledger. The more he tried to manipulate, the stronger my control became, anchored in law, procedure, and moral clarity. Community echoes played their part as well. A shopkeeper mentioned Tom's claims in passing, carefully noting the inconsistencies. A neighbor confirmed seeing him enter the bank alone, contradicting his story. Each small observation, naturally occurring, reinforced the documented truth. The narrative was no longer mine to defend, it was public fact, quietly unstoppable. Detective Larson called again, confirming receipt of the latest call records, visit, times, and documented correspondence. Everything you've submitted is consistent. Nothing here can be disputed. If he continues, it will only strengthen your case. Step by step, the emotional ambush failed to penetrate the calm I had built. By handling every attempt with procedural accuracy and moral restraint, I turned each attack into reinforcement. The ledger became more than a record. It was a weapon of peace. One evening, as the sun fell behind the mountains and the cold wind crept down the ridge, I reflected on the strategy. Revenge in its common form, shouting, retaliation, anger, was unnecessary. The law, combined with meticulous documentation and community alignment, delivered consequences more permanent and meaningful than any outburst could. Tom's manipulations had created a paper trail of inevitability. Each fraudulent attempt, each forged signature, each emotional plea now served as proof of his own design against him. By the seventh day, Tom's visits and calls had slowed, replaced by cautious silence. He had learned, in subtle, painful increments, that every move was now accounted for. The ledger, the filings, and the community's quiet awareness had created an inescapable lattice of truth. I closed the day with a walk along the ridge behind Ben's house, the pine-scented wind carrying a sense of finality. The evening sky glowed faintly with the last embers of sunlight. I knew that the emotional ambush, though powerful, had been neutralized. Not through confrontation, but through methodical preparation, lawful action, and unwavering moral clarity. By Sunday morning, peace felt less like forgiveness and more like proof. The counterattack had failed, and the consequences of betrayal were now unavoidable. I returned to Ben's house, the ledger resting on the kitchen table, each entry a quiet monument to patience, discipline, and the power of truth. Outside, the mountains stood steady, indifferent, yet somehow acknowledging the moral reckoning underway. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of smoke and pine. And as I sipped the final cup of coffee for the day, I realized that the most potent revenge is often quiet, lawful, and precise, a testament not to fury, but to enduring, patience, and moral clarity. Tomorrow, the resolution would deepen. The formal protective measures, the final legal steps, and the collapse of false narratives would follow naturally from the work already done. But tonight, I allowed myself a brief exhale, knowing that each emotional ambush had been logged, recorded, and neutralized. The ledger remained open, the mountains silent, and the town quiet. Yet I knew with absolute certainty that the reckoning, measured, lawful, inevitable, had begun. The next day, I stepped out into a pale Utah sunlight that made the frost on the ridge glint like scattered glass. My ledger was tucked under. My arm, every entry, every call, every visit meticulously noted. Today was not about emotion. It was about establishing unassailable boundaries. The groundwork from the previous week had prepared me for this moment: public exposure and legal containment. I walked to the county courthouse, a familiar brick building whose steps had carried me through decades of small-town life. Tom was there, predictably pacing near the bank across the street, attempting to assemble a public image of concern and authority. I didn't rush or confront. I let the courthouse steps, the polished brass handrails, and the gathering crowd set the stage. A handful of neighbors, people who had witnessed fragments of the truth, now assembled casually, not to gawk, but to witness. They had seen the patterns, the inconsistencies, and were ready to affirm them quietly if asked. Their presence was a reminder: truth has a gravity that rumor cannot match. I approached the steps slowly, the ledger visible in my hand. Tom noticed me, his confident mask faltering for the first time. I stopped a respectful distance away, opened the ledger, and spoke one simple statement. All accounts, filings, and property claims previously questioned have been verified and corrected. The discrepancies were documented and reported. Everything is now accurate and legal. The words were simple, precise, and weighty. Silence settled immediately. Onlookers glanced at each other, murmuring quietly. Tom opened his mouth, paused, then closed it again. He had built a story of chaos and victimhood. Now, the ledgers. Clarity undid it effortlessly. I allowed a clerk who had accompanied me to read aloud select entries, dates, and corrections. Nothing inflammatory, nothing dramatized, only facts. Each affirmation from the clerk, each acknowledgement of the filings, fortified the public record and anchored the truth in a way no argument could overturn. Later that morning, I returned to Ben's house to prepare the protective order. Detective Larson had already verified all prior documentation. The forms were filled, restrictions on contact, clearly defined distances, and stipulations about property access. Every attempted harassment, emotional plea, or visit from Tom had been logged, time-stamped, and entered into official records. At the police station, I signed the final documents, each signature a quiet assertion of boundaries and safety. Officer Daniels handled the serving of the order with professionalism, explaining to Tom that violations would be met with immediate legal consequences. I observed silently as the papers were delivered, noting the moment in my ledger. For the first time, he truly understood that manipulation could no longer override law and procedure. Next, I contacted creditors and service providers tied to the contested accounts. "Please ensure all access by Tom is revoked," I said. "All notifications and transactions must now route through me or the legal representative on record." Each clerk confirmed compliance, and I recorded every interaction meticulously. Community perception solidified naturally. Neighbors who had been uncertain now had verified information. The town quietly aligned with the facts. Every conversation in the hardware store, diner, and post office reinforced the same truth. The ledger, the filings, and official documents were unassailable. The social narrative, once murky and manipulated, now reflected reality. Evenings were spent reviewing footage from local security cameras. Small details, like Tom's hesitation at the bank or his repeated, unauthorized attempts to enter the property were captured and cataloged. Each image reinforced the protective order and legal filings, creating an unbroken chain of accountability. By the end of the week, Tom's attempts at narrative control and emotional manipulation had collapsed entirely. He could no longer visit, call, or influence the accounts, property, or perception of the community. Legal containment, backed by documented evidence and public awareness, had neutralized his efforts. Sitting on Ben's porch that night, the ledger closed on the table beside me, I let the silence settle. The courthouse steps, the police station, and the protective order had transformed the truth from personal vindication into procedural inevitability. The town, the law, and my own meticulous record-keeping now reinforced what I had known all along. Consequences are far stronger when delivered calmly, lawfully, and without theatrical display. Justice, in its purest form, did not shout. It simply appeared, measured, documented, and inescapable. The morning air carried a sharp chill, typical of early Utah winter, as I walked along the ridge behind Ben's house. The frost on the evergreens glimmered like shards of glass in the weak sunlight. My ledger, now thicker with every logged call, visit, and legal filing, rested under my arm. Each page represented a step in the quiet but inexorable unfolding of consequence. After the protective order had been served and community awareness had aligned with fact, the next phase was inevitable: closure through tangible outcomes. I began by contacting every creditor and service provider linked to the disputed accounts. Each conversation was calm, deliberate, and meticulously documented. Please ensure all access by Tom is revoked. All notifications must route through me or my legal representative, I stated evenly to bank clerks, insurance agents, and utility managers. Each confirmation was logged, a measured assertion of control replacing the chaos he had tried to impose. By mid-morning, the first ripple of the consequences reached Tom. Calls from institutions confirmed the protective order, denied him access to accounts, and reinforced the legal consequences of any attempt to interfere. The procedural precision left him with no loopholes, no plausible avenues to reclaim his narrative. I recorded the reactions. A voicemail left unanswered, an email returned unread, a phone call redirected by the bank. Late that afternoon, I received confirmation that the protective order had been fully enforced. Officer Daniels had verified. Delivery to Tom's residence and any further contact would constitute violation. I entered this into my ledger, noting the exact time and date. The pattern was complete. Documentation, legal enforcement, and community acknowledgement aligned perfectly. Then came the unexpected, yet inevitable, violation. Despite the order, Tom appeared at Ben's property boundary, perhaps hoping to provoke a reaction or test compliance. Security cameras captured him pausing at the edge of the driveway, glancing at the house, and leaving without attempting entry. I forwarded the footage to Detective Larson immediately, creating another documented entry for the ongoing record. For him, it was a minor act of rebellion. For me, it was another thread in the fabric of proof. By evening, I reviewed the cumulative effect. Job applications that Tom had manipulated, credit lines he had claimed, and property claims he had attempted were all frozen or corrected. His reputation, once inflated by manipulation, began to crumble quietly but surely. Community members, now aware of the facts and corroborated by documentation, viewed his actions as cautionary rather than sympathetic. The ledger, security footage, and procedural filings had turned manipulation into tangible accountability. I spent the night walking through Ben's small garden, the frost crunching under my boots. The cold seemed to sharpen clarity. Each step reminded me that the battle had never been about revenge in its traditional form. Fury might feel satisfying for a moment, but lasting consequence comes from law, order, and unassailable record. Tom's collapse was not theatrical. It was inevitable, executed through careful preparation and calm persistence. The following week, I made one final round of communications. Creditors confirmed the closure of all accounts in his name. The protective order was noted in public records, and community awareness solidified as law and fact intertwined. Each interaction, every confirmation, was logged in the ledger, a meticulous chronicle of consequence. By the end of the week, Tom had lost the ability to manipulate accounts, property, or social perception. The ledger now stood as a quiet monument to procedural justice. Each entry was a testament to patience, discipline, and the enduring power of documented truth. He had built his narrative on shortcuts, emotional manipulation, and assumed impunity. The law, coupled with methodical documentation, ensured those assumptions no longer held. Sitting on Ben's porch that night, I closed the ledger, watching the last orange glow of the sun fade behind the mountains. The frost sparkled in the dimming light, the air crisp and still. Justice had not been loud. It had arrived through precision, integrity, and patient diligence. Tom's collapse, while irreversible, had been achieved without confrontation, without spectacle, and without personal compromise. I exhaled slowly, the cold air filling my lungs, realizing that the final containment was not just a legal victory, but a moral one. The boundaries were clear, the facts irrefutable, and the community, once vulnerable to rumor, now aligned with truth. Each documented step had reinforced my dignity, my patience, and my moral stance. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of emotional closure, transitioning from enforcement to reflection, and eventually toward grace. But tonight, I allowed myself to acknowledge the quiet triumph of patience and preparation. Justice didn't need to shout. It simply arrived, measured, inevitable, and enduring. By the time the frost melted in the first light of morning, the noise, the lies, and the emotional ambushes had ceased. Tom's narrative was no longer a threat. I had not sought vengeance, I had sought consequence. And that, in the end, was far more powerful. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the small lakeside cafe where I had agreed to meet Tom. The air smelled faintly of coffee and frying bacon, mingling with the crisp Utah morning. I arrived first, choosing a booth by the window so I could watch the quiet ripple of water outside and gather my thoughts. Today wasn't about spectacle or community witnesses. It was about clarity, conversation, and final boundaries. Tom walked in shortly after, his coat pulled tightly against the cold. He paused at the doorway, glancing at the lake, then at the booth, as if measuring whether he still had any control over the situation. I stayed seated, hands folded over my ledger, calm, letting the moment stretch. He approached and slid into the seat across from me, the creak of the chair louder than his words. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The waitress brought menus, and Tom ordered without looking at me, his fingers tapping on the table as though trying to summon courage. I didn't offer anything but a quiet nod. The silence itself carried the weight of the past weeks. The ledger entries, the protective order, the consequences meticulously documented and enforced. Finally, he spoke. I didn't realize it would get this far, he said, voice low and uncertain. I thought you'd forgive, or I don't know. I set my coffee down slowly, my eyes on him. Tom, this isn't about forgiveness. This is about truth. Everything else, the lies, the manipulations, the boundaries you ignored, it all comes down to facts now. He swallowed hard, eyes flicking to the ledger on the table. I never wanted it to end like this, he admitted. I needed money. I thought I could fix it later. I wasn't thinking about... His voice trailed off. About respect, about family, about integrity, I finished quietly. And that's what matters. You can't rewrite what happened, but you can choose what comes next. That's the only control you have now. He looked at me, vulnerability creeping into his expression. For a moment, I saw the boy he had been. Not the man who had grabbed my neck and called me worthless. He was unsure, exposed, and perhaps genuinely remorseful. A rare and fragile combination. I can make it right, he said hesitantly. I'll tell the truth. To the bank, to the neighbors. I'll admit what I did. I nodded, letting the pause settle. Then do it. Publicly. Honestly. Not for me, not for anyone else. For yourself. But understand this. Whatever you do now doesn't undo what happened. It only prevents it from defining the rest of your life. He exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders slightly. And the inheritance? His voice was tentative, almost childlike. I shook my head. It's gone. Already donated. Irrevocable. The house. The land. It's no longer ours. That's the consequence you'll have to live with, not because I wanted to punish you, but because integrity matters more than property. It always has. He stared. Down at the table, fingers brushing the edge of my ledger as if seeking answers from the pages themselves. For a long time, only the sounds of the cafe and the lake outside filled the space. I watched him, noting how the confrontation, stripped of anger and spectacle, carried a weight heavier than any argument could. I understand, he said finally. I'll do it. I have to. For myself, if not for anyone else. I leaned back slightly, allowing a faint smile. Not one of pride, but of quiet acknowledgement. Then the first step is yours. Make it count. We rose together, Tom hesitating a moment at the doorway before stepping outside into the sunlight. He didn't look back. I stayed seated for a few minutes longer, the morning light spilling across the table, the coffee steam curling lazily toward the ceiling. It was a moment of stillness, not triumph, the calm after consequence, the weight of truth acknowledged but not dramatized. As I left the cafe, the wind off the lake carried the subtle scent of pine and water. It reminded me of why I had endured the past weeks. For clarity, dignity, and moral consequence, not vengeance. Tom's acknowledgement, tentative as it was, marked a turning point. Not because I forgave him fully, not because the past could be rewritten, but because truth had finally been spoken and boundaries respected. Back at Ben's, I placed the ledger on the counter, closed it gently, and looked out over the frost-covered yard. The process of public exposure and legal containment had shifted into personal reckoning. The next steps would involve him taking responsibility, and me letting go of the lingering tension that had weighed on me for months. The day stretched forward, calm and quiet. Tom had a path now, narrow and honest, while I had the freedom of peace reinforced by the law, by community understanding, and by the unshakable facts I had collected. It was not reconciliation, it was accountability. And sometimes that is enough. The morning sun continued to rise over the lake, brightening the frost and sending light across the water in patterns I had long since learned to notice. Subtle, steady, and unwavering. It reminded me that while consequences are finite and necessary, life continues. The ledger, the legal filings, and the protective order were all physical evidence of that lesson. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of months of planning and quiet endurance ease from my shoulders. The ledger had served its purpose. The protective order had been enforced, the public record established, and now, at last, there was room for grace, reflection, and eventual peace. The cafe, the frost, the lake, and the morning conversation with Tom, all were markers of a path that had been long and careful but absolutely necessary. As I walked back to Ben's house, I realized the truth had finally been anchored, not by anger or dramatics, but by calm, lawful, and patient determination. And in that morning light, I understood fully. Some lessons are learned quietly, some boundaries are drawn firmly, and some reckonings are measured in conversation, not confrontation. The following Sunday, I arrived early at the small community hall in Haversfield. Light filtered through the tall windows, casting soft squares across the polished wood floor. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and frozen earth, typical of mid-December in Utah. The hall was quiet, save for the murmur of a few early arrivals. Today, it wasn't just about personal reckoning. It was about truth publicly acknowledged, legacy preserved, and the community understanding the facts without rumor or embellishment. Tom arrived shortly after alone, his coat heavy and hands tucked in pockets. His gait was measured, almost tentative. He had agreed to speak publicly, a simple acknowledgement of the events, without deflection, excuse, or embellishment. It was a far cry from the loud defiance and entitlement he had displayed just weeks ago. The contrast was stark. The pastor, a man I had known for decades, greeted me with a brief nod. "Morning," he said, voice low, eyes kind but serious. "The space is yours." I settled into a chair near the side, letting the room take shape. Townspeople trickled in, neighbors, old friends, even a few local business owners who had been witnesses to the subtle ripple of the legal and social consequences. The hall slowly filled, the low hum of conversation blending with the faint ticking of a wall clock. There was no fanfare, only the measured anticipation of people accustomed to ordinary lives interrupted by extraordinary events. When Tom stepped to the front, the room quieted almost immediately. He cleared his throat, glanced briefly at me, then addressed the crowd. I need to speak about what happened with my father," he said, voice steady despite the tension. "I made mistakes. I was greedy, impatient, and disrespectful. I thought I could get away with things I had no right to touch." He paused, letting the words land. Heads nodded quietly, some eyes glistening, some skeptical but attentive. I could see in his posture the weight of recognition, the shift from entitlement to accountability. The ledger, the filings, the legal consequences, all had prepared him for this. He had no choice but to face the truth. "I tried to manipulate accounts, property, and trust," he continued. "I tried to rewrite my father's generosity as weakness. That was wrong. And I am here to admit it, not for sympathy, not for forgiveness, but to make it right where I can." The hall remained silent. The weight of simplicity carried more authority than any dramatic apology ever could. The pastor nodded, his expression solemn. "Truth spoken is a gift to both speaker and listener," he said softly. "We acknowledge the courage it takes to admit fault and the clarity it brings to all involved." Tom finished by detailing the specific missteps, attempts to access accounts, property claims, and the false narratives he had spun among certain neighbors. He read a short, prepared statement, factual and straightforward, ending with, "I accept the consequences, and I will no longer interfere with my father's life, property, or dignity." When he stepped down, there was no applause, no dramatics, only quiet acknowledgement, the kind that carries more weight than clapping ever could. Neighbors and friends came forward, some offering brief handshakes, others nodding silently, reinforcing the moral closure that had been so painstakingly achieved. Later, in a private moment, the pastor approached me. "You handled this well," he said, voice low, almost a whisper. "Justice and grace rarely walk the same path, but today they did." I nodded, feeling the steady calm of completion. The community's understanding, the public acknowledgement of truth, and the enforcement of consequence had aligned. It was not vengeance. It was moral clarity made visible. Back at Ben's, I spent a quiet hour in the garden, frost still dusting the soil, the pine trees standing tall against the weak winter sun. The ledger, now complete with the final confirmation of actions and acknowledgments, rested on the counter inside. The house, once a battlefield of entitlement and disrespect, had become a space of reflection and order. The next morning, I received a brief message from Tom. No excuses, no dramatics, just a confirmation that he had begun correcting records, settling accounts, and communicating openly with those he had misled. It was a quiet but tangible proof of reform. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I walked to the window, letting the sunlight spill across the kitchen floor. Later, I took my coffee onto the back porch, the steam rising in curling wisps, watching the frost begin to melt. A few birds hopped along the fence, pecking at scattered seeds, indifferent to human dramas. The simplicity of nature's rhythm reminded me that time, like consequence, is patient but persistent. I reflected on what had been achieved. Boundaries had been enforced, truth acknowledged, and dignity restored. Property had been donated, accounts reclaimed, and reputation clarified. The community had been reminded that moral responsibility carries weight, and that patience, persistence, and lawful action often achieve what anger cannot. By late afternoon, the sun had shifted, painting long shadows across the yard. I walked along the frost-lined path, noting how life continued despite the chaos of weeks past. Children's laughter carried faintly from a neighboring yard. A neighbor waved from across the street, and I waved back. The gestures were small, but significant, quiet markers of normalcy returning. The final gesture came when a local teacher, present at the community hall, approached with a small envelope. Inside was a brief note from Tom, acknowledging his actions and pledging continued responsibility. I placed it alongside the ledger, a subtle but meaningful symbol of closure, the past accounted for, the future bounded by honesty. That evening, I brewed a fresh cup of coffee, sitting by the window with the frost glinting faintly on the garden. I didn't need to replay events or savor triumph. There was no satisfaction in vengeance, no sweetness in spectacle. The quiet resolution, truth spoken, boundaries respected, consequences enforced, was enough. Looking out across the yard, the frost beginning to yield to the evening sun, I realized that the house, the land, and even the people around me were no longer tethered to fear or deception. The truth, now publicly acknowledged, had restored a subtle but profound balance. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter, one of reflection, routine, and the slow cultivation of peace. But today, the act of public acknowledgement had shifted the arc entirely. The community understood, the betrayer faced accountability, and I had preserved dignity without bitterness. As the last light faded, I felt a quiet smile lift. The ledger had been closed. The consequences had taken root, and the truth, once obscured, had found its rightful place. The past had been accounted for, and the future remained open, bounded by honesty, tempered by patience, and softened by grace. The next morning, the frost still clung to the garden, and the lake shimmered faintly under the pale Utah sun. I stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, letting the quiet settle around me. Months of tension, planning, and confrontation had led to this, a calm, ordinary morning that felt earned, almost sacred in its simplicity. Ben was already outside, leaning on the railing, watching the birds flit between the pines. I walked over and offered a small nod. "Morning," I said, voice low, calm. "Morning," he replied. There was no awkwardness, no overstatement of relief, just steady observation. Ben had been my anchor through this whole ordeal, offering space, perspective, and sometimes quiet, advice that I had neither sought nor ignored. I poured him a cup of coffee, passing it across the railing. "It's done," I said simply. "Everything that needed correction, accounting, and acknowledgement, it's done." Ben took a slow sip, eyes on the lake. "You've carried more weight than most folks ever see," he said after a moment. "And you did it quietly without turning the town into a circus. That's rare, Jim." I looked out over the frost-covered lawn, then back at him. "It's funny," I said, "how truth, patience, and a little paperwork can do what shouting and anger never could." He nodded. "And Tom?" I sighed softly. "He's begun to make amends. Public statements, correcting the accounts, contacting those he misled. I didn't need to watch him fall. I just needed to make sure he faced what he did. The rest is on him." Ben tilted his head, studying me. "Think he'll stick with it?" I shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "I hope so. That's his choice. But whatever happens, it won't touch the peace I've found. I've done my part." We stayed quiet for a long while, sipping coffee, watching. The morning slowly deepened. The wind shifted, carrying the subtle scent of pine and thawing earth. A single bird landed on the fence post, cocking its head curiously, indifferent to human drama. It was a small reminder that life moves on, unhurried, patient, and persistent. Finally, Ben spoke again. "So, what now?" I let the words hang. "Now I live. I garden. I walk the lake. I spend time with people who matter. I don't have to relive what happened because I've accounted for it. I've drawn lines and those lines are respected. That's enough for me." Ben nodded, a small grin appearing. "You earned that, quietly, lawfully, and maybe the world could use a few more like you." I chuckled softly, letting the sound drift into the morning. Maybe so, maybe so. We lingered a moment longer, watching the frost melt, the birds resume their quiet foraging, the sun spilling across the yard in patterns I'd learned to notice over decades. It wasn't a dramatic ending. It was a measured, calm resolution. Justice had been served without spectacle. Peace had been restored, not stolen. And dignity, mine, Tom's, and even the community's, had survived intact. As I took the last sip of coffee, I glanced at the house, the garden, and the lake beyond. The ledger, the letters, the conversations, the careful documentation, all of it had led to this moment. A morning of clarity, a future still open, and a past finally accounted for. The world was quiet, but it was full of subtle proof that patience, integrity, and truth outlast betrayal. And in that quiet, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Soft, unshakable peace. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.